Jesus taught on stewardship and this word oikonomia, which is dispensation, far more than really many topics.
Dr. Fazio, when you looked at dispensationalism through the ages, what did you find as far as the development, and particularly what was dispensationalism like in the apostolic or patristic eras?
That's a great question because we do try to trace the development of thought from the first century. And, here I led out by describing dispensationalism as a modern system of theology. And yet what you see very clearly is a continuity of thought that flows from the teachings of Jesus through the teachings of the apostles throughout the early church, and just a sort of a continuous, and I don't mean by that to suggest a monolithic thought at all. In fact, church history, if you spend even a little time looking at church history, you know that nothing is monolithic. There's always a variety of ideas. Every creed and every council seem to meet around a disparity of ideas and to try to work out nuances between a range of different beliefs that were commonly held at the time. That's largely what defines church history, the progress of thought, the development and the wrestling of these different ideas. And we certainly see that in the earliest centuries of the church. Premillennialism was a predominant feature, a strikingly predominant feature of the earliest centuries of the church. It doesn't establish it, certainly for a lot of people. It doesn't carry much weight at all. But the fact is, it's something to notice that premillennialism was a prominent feature in the minds of the early church. And yet from there it developed a more amillennial ideology, which again, the term amillennialism wasn't used until I think around at least the 17th, if not 1800s, maybe even later than that, the term amillennialism. But it doesn't mean it didn't exist in the early centuries. So it's funny that that we can talk about amillennialism in the ante-Nicene era, and yet to talk about dispensationalism in that same era would strike many as a very faux pas. But I don't think it would be correct to do so. It's why we nuance dispensational thought. But the very word dispensation, as I went into a little earlier, the idea of house rule, God's management of the household of God, is one which Jesus used several times in his teaching. That's recorded in Luke in chapters 12 and in 16. Jesus' teaching referenced the matter of stewardship. In fact, Jesus taught on stewardship and this word oikonomia, which is dispensation, far more than really many topics. And yet it tends to be a little bit glossed over or just not really prominently featured. But it certainly made an impact in the apostles. We see it. Peter talks about it. Let a man account us as stewards. Each one has a stewardship. This is actually a continuation of the word dispensation. Now, when you talk about the system of theology, you'd say, well, doesn't it have different nuances? Yes, it does. Again, eschatological are among those nuances, but it is not the totality of dispensational thought. It is a striking feature, as premillennial eschatology, pre-tribulational even, is one of the striking features. And when you look at the pre-tribulationism, you say, well, that doesn't emerge as clearly in the early church. And and many of the codified ideas which form dispensationalism today don't appear in this kind of collective form. I mean, we can get into that as we talk about the development. But the fact is, the expectation of the restoration of Israel post 70 AD, we see the early church has an expectation of the restoration of Israel, which is interesting because there's a lot of anti-Semitism in early Christianity in the earliest centuries. So even to see some of those expectations is rather surprising, but it's very clear in Romans 11 and elsewhere, isn't it? So the expectation that Israel would be restored, the appearance of the man of sin, the Antichrist, the endurance of the expectation, the coming expectation of tribulation as a forward-looking thing, preceding the return of the Lord. Of course, the establishment of a millennium on earth is an idea that really occupied the early church, and a lot of discussion centered around that. Obviously, Origen pushed back, and Augustine really made a strong claim against those who believe in a banquet on earth. He associated them with being carnal Christians because of the Platonism at the time, which would sort of eschew material eating and drinking and banqueting as not spiritually minded, and that the church should have no occupation with such things. But the Lord's Supper that he anticipated in the upper room when he took the bread and the cup and said, "I won't take of this again until I take it with you in the kingdom," anticipates that the very thing that we see in Revelation when the marriage supper of the Lamb comes and Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem, touches down on earth. And so these expectations were very evident in early Christianity. And so when you put these, as well as last one I'll mention, another striking theme is the actual succession of time and the arrangement of history into epochs, a septarian arrangement or an arrangement according to sevens. And this we saw emerge in the Epistle of Barnabas and also repeated. Actually, it is indicated that it was pretty far-reaching, the idea. It was not a fringe idea that many held to a correspondence between the days of creation forming creation week. 7 days of creation, the seventh day being a day of rest, so 6 days of labor, the seventh day of rest. And then the connection with the day is with the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is 1 day. Therefore, seeing that the day of millennium rest, the seventh day, is the seventh of a succession of 7,000 years, 6 epochs of 1,000 years leading up to the final millennial state. So, those kinds of ideas, though not carried over in any evident fashion in dispensationalism today, but these are the kind of things that you look for when you're tracing dispensational thought from the earliest centuries.
Yeah, so I hear you saying there's always been a thread of dispensational thinkers since the early church. A follow-up question to that, why do you think the amillennial view or some of those non-dispensational thoughts took root? You mentioned anti-Semitism. Do you think that was a big reason why amillennialism took off and replacement theology took off? Where did those ideas get popularized? And maybe that's beyond the scope of the podcast. I don't know.
Well, I'll quickly summarize it, and maybe we can delve into it at a later time. But absolutely, anti-Semitism was significant. I also mentioned Platonism, the idea that the physical is bad and the spiritual alone is good. So if the church is spiritual, it should have no physical future at all. The idea of a physical kingdom on a physical earth, the idea of a heavenly kingdom being exclusively heavenly, Augustine's idea of Jerusalem being on earth and the heavenly kingdom being having nothing to do with earth. So you've got Platonism, you have the idea of anti-Semitism, and then perhaps most staunchly, one of those features would also be the rejection of the book of Revelation from the Eastern Church. So you don't even have an acknowledgement. And I mean, it would be more difficult to come up with judgment, the wrath of God, and these kinds of things on earth if you have a complete rejection of the entire book of Revelation. And this is one of the things that even some reformers had a hard time dealing with the book of Revelation. And if you exclude the book of Revelation from your systematic theology or from your commentary altogether, if it doesn't factor in, then it becomes a little bit easier to not be forward-looking at these things.
That's just profound to listen to all that. I mean, just to think through the deep historical roots of dispensational thought, and that really is the theme of the book that you guys have released, but just the complexity of the thought involved as well, to think about all these different aspects of dispensationalism, which starts with that consistency of a literal grammatical hermeneutic.